So the first thing we're dealing with here is to define cognitive psychology. So what is cognitive psychology? Well, to understand cognitive psychology, you have to understand what cognition is, and that's a pretty loaded term. It means a lot of different things, but basically cognition involves thinking and other mental processes. Okay, so at its core, it's thinking and problem solving, all of the things that we do with our minds and with language. But cognition also includes the perception of the world around us through our senses. So the way we perceive the world, the meaning that we extract from our senses. Cognition also involves attentional processes that allow us to focus on a particular stimulus. So a big part of cognition is understanding the control of attention, our ability to focus our attention on one particular thing or another thing. Another important part of cognition is memory, how memory operates to allow us to remember information and our intentions. A very big part of cognition is language. Language is what we use not only to communicate, but also to manipulate and store our thoughts and our ideas. So everything ultimately boils down to language. There are a lot of cognitive psychologists that also study decision making. So, as you know, humans are not the most logical beings. We do know how to make decisions logically and through deduction, but we don't always do that. There are a lot of different ways that people arrive at their decisions, that make decisions. And that's another area of study in cognitive psychology. And of course, related to cognitive psychology is the brain activity that controls all of the processes that we just talked about. So all these processes from perception to attention, all the way down to decision making. There's a group of cognitive psychologists that are very interested in studying the brain processes, the brain activity that underlines all of these things. I would also add machine intelligence, artificial intelligence. Machines haven't quite gotten to the level of humans, obviously, but we've made some pretty remarkable strides in visual processing and language processing, and we'll talk about those during the course of this course. Cognitive psychology bridges cognition with other areas of psychology. So it connects the field of cognition, this study of thinking, with other areas of psychology, and also other areas of philosophy, linguistics, cognitive sciences, and neuroscience. Now, cognitive psychology has actually been around for quite a while. The ancient Greeks did a lot of thinking and writing about the nature of how we think. For example, Aristotle, when he was talking about his memory, he used the metaphor of a wax tablet. So a wax tablet, in case you don't know, a wax tablet is what they used to use in the ancient world. It was basically it was like a little shallow box with real shallow edges, and inside the box, it was coated with a layer of wax. And then you would just get like a stick or a sharp stick and scratch symbols into the wax, and that's how they would write stuff out, and then you could share your wax tablets with other people. And then when you were done with it, all you had to do was heat up the wax tablet a little bit, and it would melt, and it would sort of clear itself for the next message. So Aristotle used that metaphor of a wax tablet, saying basically that memories were formed in the tablet like molds in hot wax, like you were molding something in hot wax. We have been working real hard to apply scientific methods from other fields to study the mind ever since Aristotle. And there's a whole history of how humans or how scientists have sort of understood thinking and the nervous system in terms of whatever the latest technology happens to be, whether it's a wax tablet. So Aristotle thought we were all wax tablets, and then we go to today where, a lot of people are saying that the brain is like a computer, which is the latest technology we have. Ebbinghaus, a psychologist named Ebbinghaus, did a lot of early studies, very detailed studies on the processes of memory. And one of the things that he discovered by studying his own memory was how we forget things. And he mapped out what was called the forgetting curve, which is essentially this time-based curve of how long we can remember things based on our ability to store that information and then get it replaced by other information. So Ebbinghaus was one of the first ones that mapped all of that out. When experimental psychology got started, at the end of the 1800s, with the founding of the research lab at the University of Leipzig, by Wilhelm Wundt, cognitive type topics were really on the menu for study. So they were really interested in studying, for example, how, our sensations and perceptions and language. And these are, classic cognitive things. And scientists like Wundt and his students studied these things for a long time. However, one of the things that one of the end results of those studies was that they were not able to sort of come up with any sort of consistent results due to the types of methods they were using. So the study of cognition really fell out of favor going into the 1920s, 1930s, and it got replaced by the behaviorist perspective. Excuse me. This behaviorists like B.F. Skinner and John Watson and Clark Hull. These people who were primarily interested in studying behavior from a stimulus response perspective. So all they cared about was what stimuli were going into a critter, whether it was a foot shock or lights or language, and what behaviors or responses were coming out of that critter. They didn't care anything about the internal mind, the thing that cognition is concerned with. They didn't care anything about that. So cognition fell out of favor as being unscientific and got replaced by this behaviorist perspective for a long time. Until starting going into the 1950s, when we started to figure out that there were a lot of things that couldn't be explained by the behaviorist perspective. Noam Chomsky was a very famous Swiss linguist, and he was able to come up with a very strong theoretical background and understanding of language acquisition in children. And one of the things that he suggested was that children have the mental capacity to learn the rules of language spoken around them without explicit feedback on the language they produce. So they seem to have an almost spontaneous way of generating language. Now, this was in direct opposition to B.F. Skinner's view, the behaviorist view. The behaviorist view said that we learn language by being reinforced by uttering certain sounds and being punished by uttering other certain sounds. And that combination of reinforcement and punishment to shape the sounds that we produce is what ultimately led to language. And Chomsky was able to demonstrate very conclusively that that was in fact not the case, that children actually spontaneously generate language and have the capacity to do so. There were a lot of other things that came about that led to the demise of behaviorism. In other words, a lot of experimental results that could not be explained by the behaviorist perspective. It was really hard to explain them. And ultimately, psychologists began to realize that the study of cognitive processes is important. It's an important part of understanding behavior to be able to figure out what's going on in the mind of humans and in critters. That you really have to understand the processes behind the behaviors, and understanding those processes that's going on inside the brain that underlies our behaviors are an important part of getting us to understand how the mind works. Another thing that really led to the rise of cognitivism in the 60s was the development of the computer. The computer was actually, was of course invented theoretically back in the back in the 30s and 40s by guys like Kurt Gödel and Alan Turing. But the machines that were actually available to academics didn't really start rolling out until the 1960s. And all of a sudden, we had these machines that processed information and that served as a really great metaphor for thinking about cognitive processes. So people started thinking about the human mind as an information processing mind. So we started talking about things like, our memory and our long-term memory and our short-term memory and our processing capacity and all these other things, all these metaphors that we borrowed from the world of computation that essentially led us to view the brain as a biological computer. A guy by the name of Ulrich Neisser, who's listed there in your book, is really listed as the father of cognitive psychology. First of all, he's the guy who actually invented the term cognitive psychology, so I guess that would make him the father. And he also published a book that tied together memory, perception, attention, and language as a unified field. So he brought all of these previously separated areas of psychology, memory, perception, attention, and language, and brought them together under the umbrella of cognitive psychology. And he was really the first guy that did that, and he published a very influential textbook on cognitive psychology back in the day. And so he's seen as the father of modern cognitive psychology. Let's talk a little bit now about some current approaches to the study of cognition. Now, the approaches that we're going to look at here represent some of the ways that researchers nowadays think about how cognition works, and the way they think about how cognition works is going to influence how they design their research study. So if you think that something works in this particular way, well, obviously you're going to be doing a particular kind of study that's going to be different from somebody else who thinks that the world or the mind works another way. And there are a lot of different ways that people view cognition, which is really one of the problems of psychology, actually. Any given topic, whether it's cognition, sensation, perception, learning, memory, whatever, there's always a lot of different views, a lot of different ways of looking at it. And that's not true in other sciences. Like, for example, in physics, we have, the standard model of physics, which is pretty much, the current model of physics. And there are no currently there are no alternatives to that. We have string theory and a few other things. But right now, from a researcher perspective, there's no alternatives to the standard model of physics. Everybody who's trained in physics learns how the particles of matter interact with each other via the standard model. It's not true in psychology. There's a lot of different views on any particular topic. So, for example, one of those views in cognitive psychology is what's known, listed in your book there, as representationalism. That's a really hard word for me to say, representationalism. Now, what representationalism is, it's pretty straightforward. Basically, all it means is that knowledge about the world is represented in our minds. Okay, so we actually have representations in our minds of the reality outside of our mind. And furthermore, not only do we have these representations, but our cognitive processes can operate on those representations and manipulate them. Okay, so for example, if I'm hungry, one representation one thing that will really get my attention is a big juicy cheeseburger. And if I see a big juicy cheeseburger, my attentional process is going to be focused on that representation of the cheeseburger that's sitting in my head because I'm so hungry. Representationalism came out of computer and information processing models of cognition. In other words, computer scientists had to figure out how to represent data inside of a machine. So that sort of problem became one that cognitive psychologists adopted and said, hey, how do how do we represent the various aspects of reality in our minds? And that's basically where it came from. Researchers that work under the representationalism umbrella think of information as being stored in the mind and available for processing as we interpret and analyze and alter the information in our way of thinking. One of the really powerful things about representationalism is that it connects very well with the biological perspective, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. Because the theory or the thinking is that yes, we represent our thinking in our minds. This occurs in our brains, which of course is the biological substrate of our thinking. So there's a direct link there between what we're representing and the biological substrate that is being used to represent that particular thing. Another perspective, if we move on from representationalism, another perspective that is actually very interesting to me is embodied cognition. Embodied cognition basically examines cognition as an interaction between humans or other critters and their environment. Okay? So it's not just, it's not just, what you see that forms a representation in your mind, and the processes follow from whatever it is you're seeing. It's not just that. Embodied cognition implies that our entire body, everything that we're sensing with our body, from the rumbling in your tummy to the aches and pains in your bones, to the itches that you have, and the experience of walking through space, of navigating your body through space, all of that is part of cognition. All of that is necessary for us to be able to do cognition. It's a very different approach from representationalism, because representationalism basically just says, hey, you know what? If I have anything like a brain or a computer that can represent objects inside of itself, then I can put algorithms on there to manipulate those objects, and I'll create, I can create cognition anywhere, whether in a human brain or in a computer. Embodied cognition says, no. It's a lot more than that. To have true cognition like a human, you have to have a human body. You have to have a human body that takes in information and interacts with the environment the way a human body does. So one of the consequences of this embodied cognition perspective is that artificial intelligence, a general artificial intelligence, is impossible. Basically, if you're really hardcore embodied cognition person, you don't think it would ever be possible to fully develop a totally sentient artificial intelligence that's just like a human, because that AI would just be a computer. It wouldn't have a human body, and so it wouldn't be able to experience the world the way we experience the world through our bodies, and thus it wouldn't be able to think about things the way we do. So, it's an interesting perspective. It's one that I have been very interested in, mainly because of the fact that I have been over the last several years working with artificial intelligence and realizing how hard it is to do. It's like really hard to do. So I think, there's got to be a reason why it's so hard. But anyway, so we have representationalism, embodied cognition. Another perspective is the final one that we're going to cover here is the biological perspective. So the biological perspective is pretty straightforward, right? It's based on how the brain works. So it uses metaphors based on how the brain works. So the theories that come out of a biological perspective of cognition are basically all related to how neurons in our brains network with each other. So it's a very much of a networking type of set of theories. Sometimes you'll have some of the older, broader theories talked about how different brain parts linked to each other. So how the amygdala links to the hippocampus, links to the ventromedial cortex, to the visual cortex, all these, mappings of all these different brain areas. But this is still a very strong perspective because we have more and more tools nowadays to study living human brains. So we don't actually have to kill you anymore to look at your brain. We can actually look at your brain while you're still alive. And there have been a lot of theories that have come out of this, which we'll talk about later. But it's an interesting perspective, one that tries to link directly the functions of the human brain to the thinking and problem solving that we do with our human brains. But the biological perspective is very connectionistic. It's very connectionistic. In other words, it's really based on connected neurons, all networked together and doing magical things because they're all networked together. Let's talk a little bit about research and cognitive psychology. The field of cognitive psychology is of course one of the fields of experimental psychology, and as you know, experimental psychology purports to be very scientific. So the scientific method is of course a core component of how we do things, and there are 4 core principles that I know you've learned about. My kids have learned about it in their school, and I've taught these principles in my experimental psychology classes. So I know at some point in time you've heard these, but let's go over them because they are in your book and you will get some test questions on them. The first core principle is empiricism. Empiricism is the key to understanding new things. Empiricism means that the key to understanding new things is systematic observation. In other words, it's not dogmatic where you just listen to somebody tell you what's going on. It's not intuitive where you just sort of like guess what's going on. The way you figure out the way you understand how things work is by direct observation. That is the key to empiricism. Another principle related to the scientific study of anything is determinism. Behaviors have underlying causes, and understanding involves identifying what those causes are. Okay, so it doesn't mean that our lives are predetermined. That's not what we mean here. What determinism is that there's a cause and effect relationship between behaviors and other things, and it's our problem, our job to figure out what those other things are. So behaviors don't just arise spontaneously. There's a direct causal chain of processes and events that caused you to do a certain behavior, to think a certain way, and we can understand what those causal events are because we believe they are deterministic. The third core principle of the 4 that we're going to cover here is testability. You have to state your theories and your ideas in ways that allow them to be evaluated through observation. So you can't just say, I think this is going to happen, and then be done with it. You have to say specifically what you think is going to happen, why you think it's going to happen that way, and then observe to see if it really happened. This is the core of testability, is this expressing things in such a way that they can be tested, and then observing to see if the thing you hypothesized about really did happen. This is very different. Compare and contrast this, for example, with conspiracy theories, right? Conspiracy theorists, right? You can't ever disprove a conspiracy to a conspiracy theorist. It's impossible, because as soon as you bring something up, they will just counter with you and say, no, that's not right because this. And you bring something up, they'll say, no, that's because of this. And they'll just constantly be going on. And the main reason for that is because all of their ideas are not testable. They don't express their ideas or think about their ideas as something that needs to be tested and verified. They already believe it a priori. And so whenever you challenge them on it, they're just going to come up with another explanation. And then finally, so we have empiricism, determinism, testability. The fourth and final core principle of the scientific method is parsimony. Parsimony simply means that we prefer simple explanations over the more complex explanations. So if you have a different set of explanations for a particular phenomenon, something you've observed, the explanation that you're going to go with from a scientific perspective, the one that you're going to go with is the simplest one, the one that involves the least amount of moving parts, the least amount of theoretical constructs. Steven Weinberg, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, put it another way. He said that we go for beautiful, beautiful theories, right? And to him, a beautiful theory was one that was as simple as possible, that explained as much as possible. So, my canonical example of a beautiful, parsimonious theory is Darwin's theory of evolution through natural selection. It's a very simple idea, but it explains so much in so many different areas of psychology, biology, geology. It's a very powerful tool that Darwin came up with. It's extremely parsimonious, extremely elegant, and extremely beautiful. So empiricism, determinism, testability, and parsimony are the four core principles. The other thing, of course, that you have to understand about the scientific method is about our friends, the variables. You guys have, those of you that have suffered through experimental psychology know about your dependent variables and independent variables. Of course, dependent variables is the thing that you're measuring, the thing that you want to explain, the response. That's what the dependent variable is. It's whatever behavior you're interested in, whatever response you're interested in, whatever phenomenon you're interested in. That's what the dependent variable typically is. And you compare and contrast the dependent variable with the independent variable. The independent variable is the variable that causes that. Well, we theorize that causes the dependent variable to change, right? So science is all about figuring out the relationship between independent variables and dependent variables, figuring out which independent variables cause a particular dependent variable to behave in a certain way. That's what science is all about. That's what it boils down to, is just figuring out the causes and effects related to independent variables and dependent variables. You can think of independent variables as the cause, and you can think of dependent variables as the effect in this relationship of cause and effect. And of course, the only way you can establish a causal relationship is through a proper experiment where you manipulate an independent variable or independent variables, more than one, and then see what the effect is on a particular dependent variable that you're measuring. There are a lot of different research methodologies that are used in cognitive psychology. One of the things that we do as scientists, and cognitive psychologists are no different, is that we need to design research studies to test the predictions derived from our theory, right? So you got to do research. You have to do a study to test your predictions. And there's a lot of different research study methodologies that are available to us as cognitive psychologists. The first one is, of course, the ever famous case study. The case study basically is a particular type of research methodology where you focus an intensive analysis on a single individual or on a particular single phenomenon or occurrence or observational unit. For example, one of the famous examples of research methodologies is famous examples of case studies is serial killers, right? Anytime we get a serial killer like Ted Bundy or one of those guys, there's always a team of psychologists that go in there and do a case study evaluating their lives, and to the minutest detail to try to figure out, like what happened. But you don't have to be a serial killer to be a subject of a case study. You just have to have some sort of unique, phenomenon happen to you that is of interest to scientists. There was a guy named HM who he went by HM anonymously until he passed away just a few years ago. His real name was Henry Molaison, I think. I can't never pronounce that name, but he was a Canadian person who had severe epilepsy, and he received brain surgery removing his temporal lobes as a last-ditch effort to treat his epilepsy. And it turns out they also removed his hippocampus, so he ended up with memory impairments. And researchers used his special case to understand the nature of memory and the relationship of memory to the hippocampus, which is a structure in our brains. The advantage during case studies is that these really intense observations allow the researchers to identify many of the variables that might be important to this particular phenomenon and to speculate about the relationship between those variables. The disadvantage to these methodologies is that it centers on describing and explaining the behavior of a single unique example. And just because you got this one person doing this thing doesn't mean that you can generalize those results to others. So it's kind of hard to generalize a case study. However, it's a great way to discover some of the variables that you should be studying in other studies. Another type of study that's done in as a research method in experimental psychology are correlational studies. And these are basically where you observe groups and record many, many variables all at the same time. You observe and record just a bunch of variables at the same time. And once you record all these variables, so you're just watching things as they naturally occur, recording your measurements. And then once you've recorded your measurements, you look for patterns, you look for relationships among the different variables. So it's fairly straightforward. It's a fairly straightforward thing to do. For example, one of the things that we're trying to figure out right now are the ways in which smartphones are affecting our cognitive ability. Like for example, back in the day before smartphones, I had to remember a whole bunch of phone numbers and a whole bunch of other things. If I was having an argument at a bar with somebody about a movie or something, well, I couldn't just Google it real quick there at the bar. I had to remember the details about the movie or the baseball game or whatever it was that you're arguing about. What are the consequences of us not having to remember so much stuff anymore, of having a machine in our hands that can, where we can recall things, we're still trying to figure that out. So there's a lot of correlational studies going on to see, what sorts of outcomes in our behaviors correlate with the use of the smartphone. Now, the thing about correlational studies, and this is something I hope you've already learned by now, is that correlation does not imply cause. In other words, you cannot determine the causal relationship between the variables, okay? It's because you're not doing a proper experiment. You're basically seeing these two variables go up together, go down together, or, as one variable goes up, the other one goes down, but you see some pattern of relationship. But just because you see a pattern of relationships there doesn't mean that this variable is causing this variable to move. You can't say that just based solely on a correlational study. So the advantage of a correlational study is that you can observe many variables at once. And if you're just doing it in a natural context, it's awesome because you're just watching stuff naturally and recording all these variables. So it's a very powerful method for just observing and recording what happens in nature. Of course, the disadvantage is that correlation does not equal cause. You cannot state that this thing caused this thing simply based on a correlational study. This is something you need to remember because a lot of the studies that you see on the internet that are, you're reading on Facebook or Twitter or something, and you see, something so and so causes so and so, bacon causes cancer, something like that. But if you look at the study, you see that it was a correlational study. They basically just said, well, yeah, there's this relationship between, people eating bacon and getting this type of cancer, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's a causal relationship. And then finally, the most powerful method that we have for evaluating cognitive phenomenon are experimental studies. And these are studies that intentionally involve the manipulation of a variable, usually the independent variable, of course, and you focus your investigation on the effects of manipulating one variable on another variable. So you focus on investigating and systematically controlling independent variables, and then looking to see what sorts of systematic effects are occurring on the dependent variables. So, for example, one of the things that you would do is you would have two groups, and you would keep the two groups constant and equal across everything except across the different independent variables that you're measuring. So, for example, if I wanted to measure the effects of sugar consumption on the attention, on attention abilities in 5-year-olds, well, I would have two groups of 5-year-olds, right? And they would be equally the same in terms of their age, obviously, because they're 5, in terms of the breakdown of gender, in terms of socioeconomic status, races, everything I can think of. I would try to make those two groups identical, except for one thing, and that is the amount of sugar I gave. I would give one group a whole bunch of sugar, the other group no sugar, and then I would see the difference. And in that way, by controlling all the variables except for the ones that you're manipulating, which are your independent variables, you can ensure that the only difference you're seeing between the two groups is due to the manipulation of your independent variable and not some external thing. Of course, the advantage of experimental studies is they're very powerful. They make researchers much, much more confident about testing the cause and effect relationship between variables. One of the disadvantages to experimental studies is you have to be real careful about generalizing conclusions that are drawn from experiments. So, for example, in a worst case scenario, you may have controlled your variables so much that it makes it really difficult to generalize your studies out to the real world, for example. So it's one of those things that you have to take on a case-by-case, study-by-study basis to understand. Cognitive psychology is a scientific study of cognition, which means we have to measure stuff. We have to measure something. But here's the problem. In cognitive psychology, we're talking about cognitive processes. And unfortunately, not all cognitive processes have obvious, directly observable outcomes or behaviors. And the other thing, too, is, we're interested in more than just the final outcome, the output. We're not behaviorists, right? We're interested in what's going on in the mind, right? So we're interested in mental processes that occur. So the huge challenge that faces cognitive psychologists is, how do you measure something that is inside of the mind? How do you do that? Well, there's a lot of different ways, a lot of approaches that we take, and they basically boil down to a couple, right? One of them is accuracy. So we will give participants in a study a particular task to do, and this task might be, answering questions on a quiz, solving a puzzle, on and on and on, right? And one of the things we assess is accuracy. How well did they do? How accurately did they do? How many answers did they get right? How many parts of the puzzle did they complete correctly? How many objects did they correctly identify? Whatever, right? These types of measures of accuracy are used in research designs where there's right and wrong responses, where there's going to be a right and a wrong. And we tie those measures of accuracy to the processes that we think are underlying them in the mind. So if I believe, for example, that that if I teach you a set of syllables, and then I give you, so I have you learn a set of syllables, And then I have you learn another set of syllables. And then I test you on that first set of syllables that I showed you. And my theory is that there's processes in place that are going to cause you to sort of forget that first set of syllables because they're going to be interfered with by the second set of syllables. So I have this I have this theoretical idea of processes operating in your mind. And the way that I'm going to evaluate that is to see how well you remember that first set of syllables, right? And I'm going to, and if it is in fact true that the folks that had to learn a second set of syllables have problems recalling information from the first set, that's going to be a bit of evidence suggesting that my model of what's going on in the mind might be the correct model, might be the more accurate model. And of course, science works as a group activity. So it's not just me doing this research. It's a bunch of other people doing this research. And together we all operate under these different assumptions of these mental processes. And we put together evidence piece by piece from many different investigators to ultimately create these mental process models of the mind. So another measure, like accuracy, is response time, is where we measure how long it takes to respond to a stimulus. So, for example, I'll present a sound stimulus and, measure how long it takes for you to press a button. Or I present to you a bunch of objects on a screen and you have to recognize, you have to be looking for a particular object. And then if you see it, you hit a button. And I'm measuring your reaction time, how long it takes you to recognize that object and push the button. Another sophisticated measure of response time is eye movement measures. We actually have equipment now where we sit you down in a device and have you look at a screen. And it's kind of like those of you that have had eye exams before, where you put your chin down in the machine and the little machine blows a puff of air in your eye. I hate those things. But anyway, it's kind of like those. You put your face in this thing, but instead of blowing a puff in your eye, the machine is actually watching your eyeball, and it's able to see where you're focusing your attention. And it's a much more in some types of studies, it's a much more accurate way of assessing where you're focusing attention and how you're responding to things, as opposed to just pushing a button whenever you see something. If we want to go beyond accuracy and response time, we have the new field of cognitive neuroscience. For example, cognitive neuroscientists use technologies like EEGs, electroencephalograms, which are basically measures of electrical brain activity, and they look at the relationship between your mental processing during while you're doing tasks and your electrical brain activity. We also have functional magnetic resonance imaging, which basically gives us these maps of which brain areas are active during a particular task. You put this together, right? You don't just, have the cognitive neuroscience or just the response time based studies. All of these new technologies like EEG and MRI are combined with the old stuff and with older techniques and you add all those together to help us gain an insight into mental processing. A few things that you need to keep in mind: these measures are often indirect measurements, right? So in other words, if I have a theory of if I have a theory of memory processing, I'm not directly measuring the memory processing in the brain per se, right? I mean, I can't even say that if I'm using EEG or MRI, right? Because we're not exactly sure, right? But we are using the best techniques we have to assess the results of those processes. We are measuring something that we assume to be correlated with the cognitive processes, not the processes themselves. Okay, we're not looking at the processes themselves. Right now, we do not have the technology or the ability to do that. So as a result, you have to be real careful about assessing this type of research, because we have to very critically evaluate the assumed connection between the behavior measured and the cognitive process that you think is going on in the mind, right? Cognitive psychologists are very, very skeptical people. they really are, because when you present a study, you have to be rock solid sure, or rock solid as sure as you can be, that your results, your methods really are tapping into a process that you think exists within the mind. And like I said, it's a group activity. We all work together to ultimately put together these grand models of memory, grand models of learning, grand models of attention. All of this is based on all of these different research techniques that we use as cognitive psychologists.